5,000 years ago, a civilization recorded that time itself once flowed differently, that rulers lived for tens of thousands of years, and that the world existed in a state before heaven and earth were torn apart. Why would the earliest writers preserve numbers no human lifespan could contain? Why describe creation as emerging from endless water rather than light or fire? Why insist that gods were born long before the gods most people talk about today? Why does the oldest written memory of humanity contradict the version of history we were taught to trust? Why do these clay tablets whisper of an age before order, before kingship, before the familiar story even begins? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself and let's dive in. Long before stone temples rose from desert sands, before bronze tools rang against copper ore, human memory imagined a world that had not yet learned how to be solid. Existence did not begin with fire or light, but with water, endless, unmoving, and without direction. This was not water as rain or river, but water as possibility, a substance without shape, like mist before it gathers into clouds. The ancient scribes pressed this idea into clay as Namu, a presence so vast it could not be called a goddess in the later sense. There was no face to pray to, no throne to imagine. Namu was the condition that made all other conditions possible, a boundless sea holding every future form in suspension. For the people who lived between the Tigris and Euphrates, this was not an abstract metaphor. Their land survived only because water arrived at the right time and in the right measure. When floods came gently, they left behind fertile silt, dark and rich, turning barren plains into fields of grain. When water failed or arrived with violence, cities starved or drowned. Life itself appeared to rise from water and collapse back into it. It made sense, then, that the earliest vision of existence began not with gods arguing or shaping clay, but with a quiet, infinite ocean that contained everything and expressed nothing. In this earliest state, there was no sky arching above and no ground beneath. Direction did not exist. Up and down had no meaning because there was nothing to measure them against. The scribes struggled to describe this moment, using language meant for rivers and seas to speak about a time before space itself. Namu existed alone, complete without partner or opposition, a detail that quietly defies later traditions where creation requires a divine couple. There was no sacred marriage here, no joining of opposites. Creation emerged from a single source, whole and undivided, like a thought forming before words are spoken. From this undifferentiated vastness came the first distinction. Namu brought forth Anunnaki, not as beings who walked or spoke, but as principles made visible. An was the sky, imagined as a vast dome stretching overhead, smooth and solid like an overturned bowl. Kai was the earth, dense and heavy, the ground that would one day carry cities, fields, and bones. At first they were not separate. Heaven and earth existed pressed together, locked in an embrace so complete that nothing could exist between them. There was no wind, no breath, no space for movement. Everything that would one day live was trapped as potential, unable to emerge. This image of heaven and earth fused together reflects a world before differentiation, before roles and boundaries. It is the stillness before action, the silence before a voice. But creation, as these texts insist, did not unfold gently. Order did not arise through slow adjustment. It required force. From the tension between An and Kai came Enlil, whose name carries the sense of wind, breath, and moving air. If An and Ki were mass and structure, Enlil was motion itself. His arrival marked the first act of violence in the cosmos, not as cruelty, but as necessity. Enlil forced the sky upward, tearing An away from Kai. The separation created space, and in that space air rushed in, invisible yet essential. This act gave the world room to exist. Birds would one day fly there, storms would gather there, and humans would breathe there without ever seeing it. The moment heaven and earth parted, potential turned into reality. The universe became organized, layered into sky above, earth below, and the breathing world between them. This space belonged to Enlil, not as a peaceful inheritance, but as a realm won through rupture. The ordered cosmos now had structure, but it was still young and unstable. Time itself felt different in this early world. The texts hint at an era before measured days and counted years, when existence followed unfamiliar rhythms. Water still dominated memory. Before rivers were distinguished from seas, before fresh water was separated from salt, there was only the undivided deep. Later traditions would split this primal water into distinct beings, but the older memory preserves unity. Namu came before division, before categories hardened into rules. This early vision suggests a way of thinking that sees reality emerging from oneness rather than conflict. Difference did not exist from the beginning. It was created. Separation was not a natural state, but an event. The sky had to be pushed away from the earth. Air had to be forced into being. Order came at the cost of harmony, and existence itself carried the memory of that wound. Every storm, every flood, every violent wind echoed the first act that made life possible. As the cosmos settled into its three-part form, the world began to fill. Gods were born into this structure, not descending from elsewhere, but emerging from the system already in place. They were not invaders or engineers from beyond the stars. They were functions given personality, natural forces learning names and stories. The moon governed time through its steady cycle, growing and shrinking like a visible clock in the sky. The sun crossed the heavens daily, revealing what was hidden and marking justice through light. Love and war appeared together in a single goddess whose presence mirrored the planet that shone at dawn and dusk, never choosing a single role. These deities shaped existence long before later figures entered the story. They established cycles that humans would depend on without understanding them. Day followed night. Seasons returned in rhythm. Floods arrived and receded. The world felt alive but unpredictable, sustained by powers that could nurture or destroy with equal ease. Humans had not yet appeared, but the conditions for their existence were being laid, brick by brick, current by current. Beneath the earth, water remained. The belief that fresh water flowed endlessly below the ground was not superstition, but observation. Dig deep enough, and water appeared. Springs bubbled up where none were expected. Rivers seemed to rise from hidden sources. From this experience came the idea of a cosmic deep beneath the land, an underground ocean supporting everything above it. The world was imagined as an island floating in water, with the sky acting as a solid barrier holding back the waters above. Order existed only because balance held. If the sky cracked or the earth failed, everything would return to the deep. This fragile equilibrium shaped how the earliest people understood their place in existence. Life was not guaranteed. It was maintained. Creation was not finished. It was ongoing, requiring constant attention. The world could slip backward into chaos if neglected. In this understanding, the universe was not a machine set in motion and left alone. It was a living system, always at risk, always sustained by effort. Before kings ruled cities, and before humans learned to write their own names, this vision framed reality. It spoke of a time before hierarchy hardened, before gods were organized into councils and ranks. It remembered a moment when existence itself was still learning how to exist. And in that memory, water waited patiently beneath everything, reminding the world that order was temporary, and creation had begun not with command, but with depth. As the world took on structure and the space between heaven and earth filled with movement, the idea of time itself began to settle into something recognizable, though it remained unlike anything experienced later. This was not yet the time measured by shadows on walls or notches in stone. It was a deeper rhythm, tied to cycles of water, wind, and growth rather than numbered days. Existence unfolded in long arcs rather than moments, and memory stretched far beyond a single lifetime. The early texts preserve this sensation by refusing to compress events into human-scale durations. Instead, they describe ages that feel impossibly vast, as if the world itself was still breathing slowly. The separation of sky and earth did more than create space. It introduced tension. Heaven rose high and distant, while earth remained heavy and close, and the air between them became a realm of constant motion. Winds carried clouds, storms formed and dissolved, and breath moved through living things as an invisible gift. This restless middle space was unpredictable, and the power that ruled it could nurture crops with rain or flatten cities with storms. Enlil's presence was felt not as a comforting guardian, but as a force that demanded respect. The world now functioned, but it did not promise safety. From this environment emerged the idea that order required management. Creation was not a single event completed in the distant past. It was an ongoing process that demanded attention. The gods were not merely symbols, but caretakers of specific functions. One oversaw the rising of the sun and its path across the sky, ensuring that light returned after darkness. Another governed the moon cycle, allowing months to be counted and rituals to be timed. Others watched over rain, crops, animals, and the subtle forces that determined whether life flourished or failed. This divine organization mirrored the realities of early human society, even before cities existed. Survival depended on coordination, on knowing when to plant, when to harvest, when to move flocks, and when to retreat from floodwaters. The cosmos, as imagined by these early thinkers, worked the same way. Every element had a role, and neglect in one domain could ripple outward into disaster. Chaos was not evil. It was simply what happened when balance failed. The memory of a time before clear boundaries lingered beneath this growing structure. Water still haunted every story. Before fresh rivers and salty seas were named, there was only the deep, undivided, and endless. Later traditions would personify these waters as distinct beings, but the older vision remembered unity. This matters because it reveals a world view that did not begin with conflict between opposing forces. Instead, Difference was born from sameness, and tension arose only after unity fractured. As gods multiplied, genealogy became a way of mapping cosmic history. Births marked transitions, not just in family lines, but in how reality operated. Each generation of divine beings represented a further step away from the primordial state and closer to the world humans would eventually inhabit. The earliest gods were vast and impersonal, embodying sky, earth, and water. Later ones became more specific, governing sunlight, fertility, justice, and desire. With each step, the universe became more detailed, more intimate, and more crowded. This crowding is important. The early world was not quiet for long. As divine beings filled the cosmos, interactions increased. Decisions had consequences. Authority had to be negotiated. The image of a divine assembly, a gathering where powerful forces debated fate, emerged from this complexity. The universe was no longer a solitary sea or a simple structure of sky and earth. It was a society, complete with hierarchy, disagreement, and compromise. Time, too, changed as this society formed. Events became sequential. Causes led to effects. Memory became layered. The past was no longer a single, timeless state, but a series of eras, each marked by transformation. The early texts hint at this shift by describing a world that once operated under different rules. Lifespans were longer, actions carried different weight, and the boundary between divine and mortal was not yet fixed. These descriptions do not need to be read as a literal history to be meaningful. They express the idea that reality itself matured, moving from fluid beginnings toward defined limits. The earth, now separated from the sky, began to feel like a stage prepared for something new. Fields could exist, rivers could be channeled, settlements could take root. But this potential came with risk. Floods could erase years of labor overnight. Storms could destroy what hands had built. The world was generous, but it was not gentle. This dual nature shaped the way early people understood power. Forces that gave life could also take it away without warning. Beneath all of this remained the deep waters, unseen but ever present. The belief that the world rested upon an underground ocean carried a quiet anxiety. Order depended on containment. If the waters below rose unchecked, everything would dissolve back into the state before creation. This fear was not abstract. Floods regularly transformed the Mesopotamian plains into inland seas, leaving only raised mounds where cities once stood. Each inundation felt like a reminder of how thin the barrier was between order and chaos. In this context, the idea of an age before the familiar gods gained meaning. There was a time when existence had not yet learned restraint, when boundaries were soft and identities blurred. The early stories preserve this memory not as nostalgia, but as warning. Creation required separation, but separation also created vulnerability. The world could not return to unity without destruction. As divine roles solidified, attention turned toward labor. Maintaining order required effort. Canals had to be dug, fields tended, structures maintained. Even gods, in these stories, experienced burden. The cosmos demanded work, and work produced fatigue. This idea humanized the divine in a subtle way. The gods were powerful, but they were not detached from the cost of sustaining reality. They felt strain. They complained. They sought solutions. This tension between power and burden set the stage for the next transformation, one that would forever change the relationship between the divine and the world below. The solution to cosmic labor did not come from further division among the gods, but from the creation of a new kind of being, one that would stand between earth and heaven, carrying the weight of maintenance so the gods could rest. The conditions for humanity were being prepared long before humans themselves appeared, shaped by a universe that had learned, through trial and disruption, that order was never free. The world that emerged from separation and structure still carried an unresolved problem: work. Order demanded maintenance, and maintenance demanded effort. Canals did not dig themselves, and fertile land did not remain fertile without constant attention. In the earliest imagination of the cosmos, even divine beings felt the strain of sustaining what had been created. The universe was not a self-running mechanism. It was closer to a vast estate that required endless tending. Storms had to be restrained, waters guided, and foundations reinforced against collapse. In this early age, the burden of labor fell on the lesser gods, figures who existed below the great powers of sky and wind, but above anything human. They shaped riverbanks, lifted silt, carved channels through stubborn earth, and raised the first sacred structures. Their work mirrored the agricultural toil that would later define human life: long days under the sun, repetitive motions, and the constant threat of failure. Over time, exhaustion set in. The texts describe their complaints not as rebellion against authority, but as the natural response to relentless labor without relief. This moment is critical because it reveals how creation was understood not as perfection, but as compromise. The cosmos functioned, but at a cost. The divine hierarchy, with its clear ranks and responsibilities, could not escape the reality that someone had to do the work. The cries of the laboring gods reached the depths of the world, down into the subterranean waters where Enki, the lord of wisdom and fresh water, dwelled. Unlike Enlil, whose authority came through force and command, Enki's power lay in insight and adaptation. He did not rule by breaking things apart, but by finding ways to make them function. Enki's domain beneath the earth was not dark in the sense of evil. It was hidden, like groundwater flowing unseen beneath fields. Springs that burst forth without warning were thought to be openings into his realm, evidence that intelligence and creativity moved quietly below the surface of reality. When the complaints of the laboring gods reached him, they did not provoke anger. They prompted invention. The solution Enki proposed was radical. Instead of redistributing labor among the gods or reshaping the cosmos again through violence, he suggested creating a new class of beings to take on the work. These beings would not be gods, but they would carry a trace of the divine within them. They would belong to the earth, yet remain connected to the primordial depths. They would work the fields, maintain canals, and build structures, allowing the gods to withdraw from physical toil. The materials chosen for this creation were significant. Humans were formed from clay taken from the edge of the subterranean waters, a substance shaped by both earth and the deep. Clay is soft when wet and hard when fired, capable of transformation through pressure and heat. It is humble, easily molded, and easily broken. By choosing clay, the creators defined human nature as adaptable but fragile, shaped by forces beyond its control. The act of creation itself was collaborative. Enki worked alongside a birth goddess whose role was to bring life into form, much like a midwife guiding a difficult delivery. This partnership emphasized that creation was not a single, flawless act. It involved experimentation, adjustment, and learning. The first humans were not described as perfect beings descending fully formed into the world. They were solutions to a problem shaped with purpose rather than idealism. When humans emerged, they were given tasks immediately. Their role was clear: to relieve the gods of labor. Agriculture became sacred not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Digging canals, planting fields, and raising structures were not merely economic activities, they were cosmic duties. By working the land, humans participated in maintaining the order of the universe itself. This view of humanity carries a striking implication. Humans were not created as slaves in a moral sense, nor as disposable tools. They were essential components in the balance of existence. Without them, the gods would be forced back into toil, and the system would strain again. Human labor sustained not only cities and families, but the very structure of reality as it was understood. The texts do not shy away from the imperfections of this arrangement. After creating functional humans, the gods tested the limits of their creation. Beings were formed with impairments, with bodies that could not perform standard labor. Instead of discarding them, roles were found that allowed each to contribute in different ways. This moment reveals an unexpected depth in the world view. Value was not measured solely by physical productivity. Even those who could not work fields or carry loads had a place within the community. Creation, in this telling, was not finished once humans appeared. It continued as a process of refinement. The gods observed, adjusted, and responded to outcomes. This stands in contrast to later ideas of a single, perfect creation followed by decline. Here, the world improves through effort, adaptation, and cooperation between divine intention and material reality. As humans spread across the land, they learned to transform their environment. Wild plants became crops. Animals were domesticated. Temporary shelters gave way to permanent dwellings. With each innovation, the distance between humans and gods subtly increased. Humans became more capable, more independent, and more numerous. Their activity filled the land with sound and motion. Where once there had been quiet plains broken only by wind and water, there were now voices, tools, and ritual chants rising towards the sky. This growing presence carried consequences. The very success of humanity introduced tension into the cosmic order. The gods, once relieved of labor, found themselves confronted with a different burden. The noise of human life disturbed the stillness they had reclaimed. Cities concentrated activity into dense spaces, amplifying sound and movement. The world became crowded in a way it had never been before. The relationship between humans and gods shifted. Humans depended on divine favor for floods, rain, and fertility, but the gods now depended on humans to maintain temples and provide offerings. This mutual dependence created fragility. When balance held, the system thrived. When it faltered, consequences followed on a cosmic scale. Beneath everything, the waters remained. The deep still pressed against the foundations of the world, waiting. The creation of humanity had solved one problem but introduced another. The universe had learned how to sustain itself, but it had also learned how easily harmony could be disrupted. In this tension between order and excess, between creation and consequence, the stage was set for the next great transformation, one that would redefine time, memory, and the limits of survival itself. As human communities multiplied and their labor reshaped the land, memory began to stretch backward into a time that no longer resembled ordinary life. The earliest records do not treat the distant past as a dim shadow of the present, but as a fundamentally different world, governed by unfamiliar rules. Kingship itself belonged to this other age. Authority did not emerge slowly from councils or families. It descended whole, carrying a weight that felt both sacred and alien. Rule was not earned, it was bestowed, like a force of nature arriving from above. The earliest list of rulers preserves this world view with unsettling calm. It names kings who governed not for decades, but for tens of thousands of years. These figures are not described with the detail later kings receive. They stand at the edge of memory, more symbols than personalities. Their reigns stretch across spans of time so vast that they dissolve ordinary chronology. These were not human lives as later generations understood them. They belonged to an era when the boundary between divine and mortal had not yet hardened. The first of these rulers reigned in Eridu, the city remembered as the birthplace of civilization. Eridu was not merely old, it was foundational. It was imagined as the place where order first touched the earth, where the divine plan for human life found its initial expression. The city's association with water was no coincidence. Built near what was once the shoreline, Eridu stood at the meeting point of land and sea, stability and flux. Beneath it flowed the cosmic deep, the same waters that had existed before creation took form. The king who ruled there is said to have governed for nearly 30,000 years. This number is not meant to be processed the way modern readers process dates. It signals distance, not precision. It marks a reign that belongs to mythic time, when existence unfolded slowly and continuity mattered more than change. Successive kings ruled for even longer spans, their lives blending into the rhythm of the cosmos itself. They did not age as later humans did. They endured, as if time itself had not yet learned how to hurry. 5 cities appear in this earliest memory, each associated with a ruler whose lifespan defies comprehension. These cities were not random settlements. Each represented a specific aspect of early civilization. One was linked to wisdom and water, another to metalworking and craft, another to healing and purity, another to justice and light. Together they formed a symbolic map of human development before history hardened into record. The second city, associated with metalworking, carried a name that evokes walls and copper. Metal transformed human life in ways that stone never could. Tools became sharper, weapons more effective, and craftsmanship more precise. By placing this city in the Antediluvian Age, the memory suggests that technological knowledge was not discovered gradually, but revealed early, almost fully formed. Innovation was a gift rather than an achievement, passed down from a time when gods and humans still shared space. The rulers of this age often bore names that hinted at priestly or divine status. They were not merely kings, they were intermediaries. Their authority flowed downward from the gods and outward into human society. They governed not only through force or law, but through proximity to the divine. Their long reigns expressed stability rather than progress. Nothing urgent pressed against them. The world moved slowly, like a river before it meets rapids. Time in this era behaved differently. Lifespans expanded because existence itself was less constrained. The world had not yet narrowed into the limits that would later define human life. Mortality existed, but it did not dominate imagination. Death had not yet become the central fact around which meaning revolved. The presence of gods was closer, and the distance between intention and outcome was shorter. This mythic age eventually narrowed toward a single figure whose story bridges the ancient world and the one that follows. He ruled in the final city before catastrophe, a place later remembered as the last refuge before destruction. His reign did not last as long as those before him, signaling that something had already begun to change. Time was tightening. The old elasticity was fading. The cities themselves carried memory beyond geography. They represented stages in the descent from divine immediacy into human limitation. Each transfer of kingship from one city to the next marked a step away from the source. The world was becoming heavier, more crowded, more complex. Human activity intensified, fields expanded, trade increased, noise filled spaces that had once been quiet. This noise was not just sound. It was the presence of life asserting itself everywhere. Humans built, argued, sang, prayed, and labored without pause. What had once been a solution to divine labor became a new problem. The gods, now removed from physical toil, faced a different strain. Rest became difficult. Stillness disappeared. The world vibrated with movement. In this tension, the old balance faltered. The gods had created humans to stabilize the cosmos, but humanity's success threatened to overwhelm it. Authority responded not with gradual correction, but with decisive action. The solution would not be adjustment, but reset. The memory of long-lived kings and ancient cities was preserved precisely because it ended. The Antediluvian Age closed not with decline, but with erasure. Water, which had marked the beginning of existence, returned as the instrument of ending. The same element that nourished fields and sustained life would dissolve boundaries once more. Flooding was not imagined as random disaster, but as cosmic return. When order became too loud, too dense, too heavy, the world slipped back toward its origin. This understanding casts the ancient kings in a different light. Their long reigns were not achievements to be surpassed, but conditions that could not be sustained. They belonged to a world that could exist only once. After the flood, life would resume under new rules. Time would shorten. Lifespans would contract. Memory would fracture into history rather than myth. By preserving these names and numbers, the early scribes were not attempting to deceive or exaggerate. They were marking a boundary. On one side lay a world of proximity, longevity, and divine immediacy. On the other lay the human world as it would be known thereafter, fragile, brief, and governed by limits. The list stands not as a record to be verified, but as a threshold to be crossed, separating what once was from what could never be again. The ending of the long-lived age was not remembered as a gradual fading, but as a sudden rupture, a moment when accumulated tension finally broke. The world had grown dense with life, sound, and movement. Cities pressed against their limits, and human activity filled every available space. What had once been quiet plains shaped by wind and water were now crowded landscapes marked by walls, canals, and ritual fires. The success of humanity carried an unintended weight, one that settled uneasily across the divine order. The gods had withdrawn from labor, but they had not withdrawn from awareness. They heard everything: the clatter of tools, the chanting of priests, The low hum of daily life rose constantly into the air, reaching even the highest realms. Rest became difficult. Stillness vanished. The same intelligence that had solved the problem of divine toil now confronted a different imbalance. The cosmos, carefully organized after its violent beginning, was slipping toward excess. Among the great powers, the response was not unanimous. Authority weighed order against disruption, necessity against comfort. One force in particular, associated with wind and storms, felt the disturbance most acutely. Air carries sound. Vibration travels through it. What humans experienced as ordinary noise became an unending pressure in the realm of storms and breath. The irritation that followed was not framed as moral outrage. Humanity was not condemned for wrongdoing or disobedience. The problem was simpler and colder. There were too many people, and they were too present. The decision that followed was devastating in its simplicity. To restore quiet, the world would be cleared. The flood was not imagined as punishment for sin, but as an act of cosmic maintenance. When a field grows wild, it is burned. When canals clog with silt, they are dredged. When the world itself becomes unmanageable, it is returned to water. This logic shaped the most enduring catastrophe in human memory. Yet even within divine authority, dissent existed. Wisdom did not always align with command. The same God who had conceived humanity as a solution to labor understood that erasing them entirely would undo everything that had been achieved. Without humans, the gods would once again face the burden they had escaped. Temples would fall into disrepair. Fields would return to marsh. Order would decay. Total destruction was not restoration. It was regression. Bound by divine decree, wisdom could not oppose authority openly. Once spoken, the decision to flood the world could not be reversed. Divine words carried weight precisely because they were final. But law is not the same as inevitability. Within the boundaries of command, there was room for cleverness. Where force demanded obedience, intelligence searched for openings. The warning was delivered indirectly, a whisper rather than a proclamation. It reached a king who stood at the edge of the old world, ruler of the final city before destruction. His lineage linked him to the ancient age, but his fate would belong to the new one. The message he received was precise and urgent. The waters would rise, the world would dissolve. Survival required preparation, not prayer. The vessel he was instructed to build was not described as elegant or symbolic. It was functional, heavy, sealed against intrusion. Its purpose was not travel, but endurance. The materials came from the same earth that would soon be submerged, shaped by hands that understood both labor and ritual. The act of construction itself mirrored the earliest works of humanity, digging, lifting, sealing, and reinforcing against forces that could not be stopped. Animals were gathered not as pets or companions, but as continuity. Life would not begin again from nothing. Seeds of existence had to be preserved. The world that would emerge after the waters receded needed memory encoded in flesh and instinct. Each species carried a fragment of the old order forward into the unknown. When the flood arrived, it did so with a violence that erased distinction. Wind drove water across land until boundaries vanished. Rivers overflowed and lost their paths. Cities dissolved into indistinct shapes beneath the surface. The carefully organized world returned to the condition that had preceded creation itself. For days, the vessel was carried without direction, surrounded by nothing but moving water and darkness. This was not merely destruction, it was reversal. The sky's barrier failed, the waters above and below met again. The separation forced by the first act of creation temporarily collapsed. The world remembered what it had been before structure, before division. Everything that depended on separation ceased to exist. When the waters finally receded, the silence that followed was absolute. The noise that had driven the decision was gone. Fields lay buried under silt, walls had fallen, the landscape was raw and reshaped. The survivor emerged into a world stripped of familiarity, carrying the weight of continuity alone. The first act upon returning to land was not celebration but offering. Sacrifice followed survival, acknowledging both gratitude and fear. The gods, drawn by the scent of burning offerings, recognized what had been preserved. The world had been reset, but not emptied. Authority, confronted with the consequences of its decision, shifted. Destruction had gone too far. Wisdom had been right to preserve life. The survivor was transformed by this recognition. He was no longer merely a king, but a bridge. His role was not to rule a city, but to carry memory across a boundary no one else had crossed. The age of impossibly long reigns ended with him. What followed would be governed by new limits. Time changed after the flood. Lifespans shortened. The distance between gods and humans widened. Direct intervention became rare. The world was quieter, but also lonelier. Humanity would rebuild without the closeness it had once known. The flood marked not just an ending, but a separation more permanent than the one between sky and earth. Water receded, but it never lost its significance. Floods would return in smaller forms, reminders of the reset that had once erased everything. Each inundation carried an echo of that first collapse. The deep still waited beneath the ground, contained but never gone. Order had been restored, but only under stricter rules. From this point forward, memory fractured. Myth gave way to history. Kings would live for decades instead of millennia. Records would track events rather than eras. Humanity stepped fully into its role as caretaker of the earth, no longer sheltered by divine proximity. The world had been given a second beginning, quieter, narrower, and bounded by time. The cost of survival was distance, and the memory of the old age became a shadow that would never again take solid form. After the waters withdrew and the land emerged reshaped, existence settled into a quieter rhythm. But the silence was deceptive. The world was no longer empty, yet it was no longer abundant with divine presence. What survived the flood carried memory, but not certainty. Humanity stepped onto soil that had been scoured clean, fertile yet unfamiliar, carrying with it the knowledge that life could be erased and restarted by forces far beyond human control. The first generations after the flood lived under tighter boundaries. Lifespans shortened dramatically, as if time itself had hardened. Where rulers once spanned ages, kings now measured their authority in decades. This contraction was not portrayed as punishment, but as adjustment. The world could no longer sustain the looseness of the old era. Proximity to the divine receded, and with it the elasticity that had once allowed life to stretch unnaturally long. Cities were rebuilt cautiously. Foundations were raised higher, walls thickened, and canals designed with memory of disaster etched into every decision. Floodwaters were no longer mythical threats, but lived experience passed down through story and scar. Each city placed itself under the protection of a specific god, not as a guarantee of safety, but as a negotiation. Favor had to be maintained. Balance had to be respected. The gods themselves changed in how they appeared within the world. They no longer walked openly among humans or ruled through godlike kings. Instead, their influence became indirect, expressed through omens, dreams, and the subtle alignment of events. Divine will was read in the movement of stars, the behavior of animals, and the success or failure of crops. Interpretation replaced presence. Priests rose in importance because understanding signs became essential to survival. The divine assembly still existed, but it operated at a distance. Decisions were made beyond human hearing, and consequences filtered down slowly, often without explanation. Fate emerged as a concept not because the future was fixed, but because humans no longer had access to the reasoning behind events. What once could be witnessed now had to be inferred. Within this new structure, a group of gods gained clearer definition. They were not creators or sustainers of natural processes, but arbiters. Their role centered on judgment, destiny, and the unseen transitions that defined existence after death. These beings did not belong fully to the sky or the earth. Their domain lay beneath, in the shadowed realm where all lives eventually passed. This realm was not imagined as fiery or torturous. It was quiet, dim, and final. All souls, regardless of status, traveled there. The judges who ruled this space were feared not for cruelty, but for inevitability. Once fate was pronounced, it could not be appealed. In a world where divine presence had withdrawn, final judgment carried immense weight. These gods did not shape mountains or command storms. They enforced order at the most fundamental level, ensuring that boundaries remained intact. Life ended. Death remained absolute. The flood had blurred boundaries once. Now they were guarded carefully. No being, mortal or divine, crossed these lines without consequence. Human understanding of justice evolved alongside this shift. Law codes appeared, carved into stone, and displayed publicly. Authority was no longer justified by proximity to gods, but by alignment with cosmic order. Kings ruled by maintaining balance, not by claiming divine identity. Their legitimacy rested on fairness, protection, and the ability to prevent chaos. Time became something that could be counted. Calendars tracked lunar cycles. Festivals marked seasonal change. Memory was organized into years rather than ages. Writing, once a sacred novelty, became a practical tool. Transactions, treaties, and laws were recorded, not to preserve myth, but to manage reality. Humanity began to see itself as responsible for continuity. Despite this growing independence, fear lingered beneath daily life. The deep waters were still believed to exist below the earth, restrained but restless. Every earthquake, every unusual flood, stirred anxiety that the ancient balance might fail again. Rituals addressed this fear directly, reinforcing barriers between order and chaos through repetition and symbol. Stories of the flood were retold not as distant legend, but as warning. They explained why restraint mattered, why growth without limit invited collapse. Noise, once a symbol of life, became something to manage. Excessive expansion, unchecked ambition, and disregard for balance were framed as existential risks rather than moral flaws. The relationship between gods and humans settled into reciprocity. Humans provided offerings, maintained temples, and upheld order. The gods, in return, maintained distance rather than domination. When disasters occurred, They were interpreted as signs of imbalance rather than deliberate punishment. Restoration focused on appeasement and correction, not repentance. This post-flood world valued continuity over grandeur. Monumental claims gave way to practical survival. Knowledge became cumulative rather than revealed. Innovations built upon previous efforts rather than appearing fully formed. Humanity no longer stood at the threshold between divine and mortal. It stood firmly on earth, tasked with maintaining what had been salvaged. Yet the memory of the old age never vanished. It lingered in king lists, hymns, and the exaggerated numbers that defied rational explanation. These were not errors. They were signals pointing backward to a time when reality itself was different. The distance between then and now wasn't measured only in years, but in structure. The gods of judgment embodied this distance. They did not intervene often because their role was not to guide, but to conclude. They stood at the end of every path, ensuring that no life escaped consequence. In a world where divine presence had withdrawn, finality became sacred. Humanity adapted by turning inward. Wisdom shifted from obedience to understanding. Survival depended less on divine favor and more on collective memory, law, and cooperation. The flood had ended the age of closeness. What followed was the age of responsibility. The earth, reshaped and restrained, held both promise and threat. Water nourished crops but demanded respect. Storms cleansed but could still destroy. The lesson was clear even if it was never spoken outright. Creation had been given a second chance, but it would not be given a third. Balance was no longer enforced through overwhelming force. It depended on restraint, memory, and the quiet acknowledgement that the deep still waited, patient and unchanged beneath everything. As generations passed in the quieter world after the flood, the distance between humanity and the divine continued to widen, not through abandonment, but through redefinition. The gods no longer needed constant laborers, nor did they tolerate unchecked growth. What remained was a system built on boundaries, and those boundaries shaped every aspect of life. Humanity now lived within a framework of limits that could be felt in aging bodies, shortened reigns, and the slow, predictable march of seasons. The underworld took on new significance in this environment. It was no longer just the destination of the dead, but a stabilizing force in cosmic order. Death became the final boundary that could not be crossed, reinforcing the idea that existence moved in one direction. The gods associated with this realm were not creators or destroyers, but enforcers of conclusion. They ensured that endings stayed ended, preventing the chaos that would arise if life and death blurred together again. These deities were often described collectively, emphasizing function over individuality. They did not demand temples filled with noise and ceremony. Their authority did not come from visibility, but from certainty. Everyone, regardless of status, faced them eventually. In a world still haunted by the memory of collapse, such inevitability was comforting. It meant the universe had rules that applied to all. Human society mirrored this emphasis on order. Hierarchies became formalized. Roles were defined clearly. Kings ruled within laws rather than above them. Councils advised rulers, and scribes recorded decisions. Authority became procedural rather than personal. This was not a loss of power, but a transformation of it. Stability mattered more than spectacle. With this shift came an increased focus on fate. Life was understood as a path shaped by forces beyond immediate control. Fate was not destiny in the sense of pre-written narrative, but the result of alignment or misalignment with cosmic order. Success followed harmony. Failure followed imbalance. Individuals navigated life by reading signs, interpreting dreams, and observing patterns rather than expecting direct intervention. The concept of judgment extended beyond death into daily life. Actions carried weight. Choices mattered. Not because gods watched every movement, but because consequences unfolded within a tightly regulated system. The flood had demonstrated what happened when boundaries were ignored. The lesson endured as cultural instinct rather than explicit doctrine. In stories where gods still appeared directly, their presence was often disruptive rather than comforting. Visits from the divine brought upheaval, testing, and transformation. This portrayal reinforced the idea that closeness to godhood was dangerous. Safety lay in distance, in maintaining respectful separation. Humanity learned to value mediation over immediacy. Rituals reflected this change. They became structured, repetitive, and restrained. Excess was avoided. Offerings were precise rather than extravagant. Sacred space was carefully demarcated. The goal was not to attract divine attention, but to maintain balance and prevent disruption. Silence became as important as sound. This cultural evolution also reshaped how humanity viewed its own origins. Creation stories were no longer retold as explanations of power, but as reminders of responsibility. Humans were made from sacred materials, but that sacredness came with obligation. Being formed from primordial substance did not grant privilege, it imposed duty. Work retained its cosmic significance, but it was no longer framed as service to distant gods alone. Labor sustained community, continuity, and memory. Farming, building, and governance were acts of preservation, holding back chaos through daily effort. The divine was present not in miracles, but in the functioning of systems that did not collapse. The gods of judgment embodied this worldview perfectly. They were not merciful or cruel. They were consistent. In a universe defined by stability, consistency was the highest virtue. Their decisions did not respond to prayer or persuasion. Fate, once fixed, moved forward without deviation. This certainty allowed life to organize itself around predictable outcomes. Human literature from this period reflects a preoccupation with limits. Heroes do not triumph through defiance of the gods, but through acceptance of constraint. Wisdom lies in knowing when to act and when to endure. Immortality is no longer a goal, it is a warning. Those who seek to escape death invite disaster. Memory of the Antediluvian Age survives as contrast. Long lives and divine proximity are remembered not as ideals to reclaim, but as conditions that led to imbalance. The flood stands as proof that excess, even excess of life, carries consequences. The past becomes instruction rather than aspiration. Even the language of time shifts. Days, months, and years replace ages and eras. History becomes something that can be recorded and measured. Events are placed in sequence rather than mythic suspension. Humanity begins to see itself as existing within time rather than alongside it. This acceptance of limitation fosters a different kind of creativity. Instead of monumental acts meant to rival the gods, humans focus on refinement. Law codes improve. Irrigation systems become more efficient. Writing evolves to capture nuance. Knowledge accumulates slowly, passed from one generation to the next without divine interruption. The gods remain, but they no longer dominate imagination. Their presence is felt in structure, in the rules that keep the world from unraveling. Divine silence becomes a sign of success. When the gods do not intervene, it means balance holds. The underworld judges stand as guardians of this silence. They ensure that endings remain intact, that life does not spill endlessly forward. In doing so, they protect the living from the chaos of infinite continuation. Mortality, once feared, becomes essential. Humanity learns to live within its span, to value memory because it fades, and to build because nothing lasts forever. The world after the flood is smaller, quieter, and more constrained, but it is also stable. The deep waters are contained. The sky holds. The earth supports weight. What remains from this era is a subtle understanding. Survival depends not on closeness to power, but on respect for boundaries. The gods taught this lesson not through constant presence, but through withdrawal. And in that absence, humanity learned how to endure. As stability settled into the rebuilt world, memory reorganized itself around lineage rather than proximity to the divine. The past was no longer an open landscape where gods and humans crossed paths freely. It became layered, compressed into stories, lists, and names that anchored identity. Genealogy replaced mythic presence. To know who you were meant knowing who came before, and how far removed you were from the age when existence itself felt elastic. Kingship adapted to this change. Rulers no longer claimed authority through divine blood or timeless reigns. Instead, they positioned themselves as stewards of balance, inheritors of responsibility rather than embodiments of power. Their legitimacy rested on continuity. A king ruled because order had to be preserved, not because heaven had descended directly upon him. The throne became less sacred but more necessary. Cities grew outward rather than upward. Expansion was cautious, guided by memory of collapse. Floodplains were mapped carefully. Canals were maintained with ritual precision. Every structural decision carried an awareness of fragility. Civilization was no longer celebrated as triumph over nature, but negotiated coexistence with it. Water remained central, but now as something to be managed rather than revered without restraint. Writing evolved alongside this mindset. What began as sacred marking became administrative tool. Clay tablets recorded harvests, debts, and treaties. The act of writing itself mirrored the new relationship between humans and the cosmos. Knowledge was no longer revealed, it was accumulated. Each mark pressed into clay represented effort, memory, and accountability. Errors mattered because they carried consequences. This shift influenced how stories were told. Creation myths were preserved, but they were no longer instructions for living. They became foundations, explanations of why the world functioned as it did. The emphasis moved from origin to maintenance. Humans were not asking how everything began, but how it could continue. The gods reflected this change by becoming increasingly specialized. Instead of broad cosmic forces, they took on narrow domains. One oversaw contracts, another boundaries, another childbirth, another grain storage. Divine power became distributed rather than centralized. This fragmentation mirrored human society, where roles were divided to prevent overload and failure. Among these gods, those associated with fate gained quiet prominence. Fate was not a script written in advance, but the cumulative effect of alignment. When systems functioned properly, fate appeared generous. When imbalance crept in, fate tightened. This interpretation allowed humans to believe in order without assuming constant divine supervision. The afterlife, too, became more defined. It was no longer an extension of life or a continuation of social status. It was a place of sameness. Kings and laborers arrived stripped of distinction. This egalitarian finality reinforced restraint among the living. Excess lost its appeal when it carried no advantage beyond death. Ritual practice adjusted accordingly. Grand gestures gave way to consistency. Daily offerings mattered more than rare spectacles. Temples were maintained not to attract divine attention, but to honor agreement. Religion became contractual rather than ecstatic. The goal was stability, not transcendence. This worldview shaped attitudes toward innovation. Change was approached carefully. New techniques were tested gradually. Sudden transformation carried echoes of catastrophe. The flood remained the ultimate example of abrupt change, and its lesson lingered. Rapid shifts invite collapse. Yet humanity did not stagnate. Within limits, creativity flourished. Mathematics developed to manage trade. Astronomy emerged to predict seasons. Medicine evolved through observation rather than miracle. Each advancement reinforced the idea that humans could shape their future, but only by respecting boundaries. The gods, increasingly distant, became symbols of principles rather than personalities. Their stories persisted, but their interventions grew rare. When divine action occurred, it was framed as correction rather than engagement. Silence became the default state of the cosmos, and that silence was interpreted as success. Memory of the Antediluvian Age now functioned as warning. Long lives and divine closeness were no longer aspirations. They were reminders of imbalance. The world that existed before the flood was powerful but unstable. The world after was limited but durable. Endurance replaced magnificence as the measure of worth. Human identity shifted accordingly. People defined themselves by occupation, family, and city rather than by proximity to myth. Belonging mattered more than origin. Survival depended on cooperation within defined structures rather than favor from unseen forces. The underworld judges remained constant through this transition. Their role did not expand or contract. They stood outside social evolution, enforcing the final boundary. In doing so, they anchored the entire system. No matter how society changed, death remained the same. This constancy allowed everything else to adapt. As centuries passed, the divine receded further into abstraction. Gods became principles encoded in law and ritual. Humanity learned to govern itself within a framework inherited from myth, but refined through experience. The flood marked the final moment when the cosmos intervened directly. Everything after was interpretation. This did not diminish the sacred. It relocated it. Sacredness moved from spectacle to structure, from presence to pattern. The world itself became the text to be read. Fields, rivers, and stars carried meaning, not because gods spoke through them openly, but because they obeyed consistent rules. In this way, the legacy of the earliest age persisted quietly. The primordial waters were no longer visible, but their memory shaped caution. The separation of sky and earth no longer felt violent, but its necessity was understood. Humanity lived between these realms, not as favored child, but as careful custodian. The silence of the gods was not abandonment, it was permission. The world had been given form, limits, and memory. What happened next would be shaped not by divine command, but by human restraint. and within that restraint, civilization learned how to endure. As the world matured within its boundaries, humanity's attention shifted from survival alone to meaning. The flood had taught restraint, but it had also left unanswered questions. Why preserve life only to limit it so strictly? Why allow memory of a greater age to persist if it could never return? These questions did not demand divine answers anymore. They were explored through story, ritual, and reflection, forming a quiet philosophy woven into daily life. The idea of fate deepened during this period. Fate was no longer imagined as a decree issued by distant gods at birth, but as a current running through existence, shaped by choices, timing, and alignment. A person's path could narrow or widen depending on action, but it could not escape the river entirely. This metaphor of flow reflected the environment itself. Rivers nourished when respected and destroyed when ignored. Life followed the same pattern. Wisdom came to be associated with foresight rather than power. The most admired figures were no longer conquerors or builders of monuments, but those who understood limits. Advisors, elders, and scribes gained influence because they preserved memory. Knowledge became the primary defense against collapse. Forgetting, not rebellion, was the true danger. Mythological figures from earlier ages were reinterpreted through this lens. Heroes who once challenged the gods were remembered less for their defiance and more for the consequences they suffered. Their stories became cautionary rather than aspirational. Immortality, once seen as divine favor, now appeared as burden or anomaly. To live forever was to exist outside order. The afterlife continued to reinforce this philosophy. Death equalized all outcomes. No accumulation of wealth or power altered the final destination. This understanding discouraged excess and encouraged moderation. The goal was not to escape death, but to live well within its certainty. Temples evolved into centers of learning as much as worship. Priests studied signs, recorded events, and taught traditions. Their authority rested not on miracles, but on continuity. They did not claim to speak for the gods directly. Instead, they interpreted patterns left behind by a cosmos that had grown quiet. The divine assembly, once imagined as active and argumentative, became more symbolic. It represented balance rather than action. Stories of divine conflict were preserved as metaphors for natural tension rather than literal events. Thunder no longer meant a god's anger. It meant weather. Floods meant imbalance, not judgment. This shift did not remove fear from existence, but it refined it. Fear became anticipatory rather than reactive. Humans learned to watch for signs of strain rather than waiting for catastrophe. The flood's lesson endured not as trauma, but as awareness. Kingship reflected this evolving mindset. Rulers were expected to listen, adapt, and maintain stability rather than expand endlessly. The most successful reigns were quiet ones, marked by few disasters. Excessive ambition was viewed as dangerous, a potential trigger for imbalance. Law codes emerged as expressions of cosmic order rather than human will. Justice was framed as alignment with the way things worked, not as punishment. Disputes were resolved by restoring balance rather than asserting dominance. This approach reinforced the belief that order was fragile and required constant care. Human creativity found expression in refinement rather than reinvention. Architecture emphasized durability. Art focused on proportion. Music followed predictable scales. Beauty was found in repetition and symmetry, mirroring the stability of the post-flood world. The gods, now distant, were no longer rivals or companions. They were reference points. Their stories explained why limits existed. Their withdrawal justified human responsibility. When disasters occurred, they were interpreted as reminders rather than messages. Memory of the primordial waters remained embedded in language and ritual. Water was treated with respect, bordering on reverence. Canals were maintained ceremonially, flood markers were preserved. Each generation learned where the water had reached before, ensuring that knowledge survived even when fear faded. This reverence did not romanticize destruction. It acknowledged potential. Water could renew or erase. The choice lay in preparation and restraint. The same principle applied to power, wealth, and growth. Everything that sustained life could also undo it. As centuries passed, the distinction between myth and history sharpened. Events were dated. Reigns were counted. Records accumulated, yet myth did not disappear. It retreated into foundation. It explained why records mattered, why counting years mattered, why forgetting was dangerous. The underworld judges remained unchanged throughout these transformations. Their constancy provided a fixed point in a shifting world. No matter how culture evolved, death enforced equality. This final boundary ensured that ambition remained tempered. Human identity became increasingly inward. Meaning was found in contribution rather than exception. To maintain a canal, raise a family, or uphold law was to participate in the preservation of existence itself. Heroism lay in continuity. The cosmos, once loud with divine presence, now communicated through absence. Silence became a teacher. In that silence, humans learned to observe, interpret, and adapt. The flood had been the last undeniable intervention. Everything after required interpretation. This world was not lesser than the one before. It was more delicate. It demanded attention rather than obedience. Humanity's role was no longer to serve gods directly, but to uphold the structures that allowed life to persist. The memory of beginnings and endings remained, not to inspire longing for what was lost, but to ground action in what remained. The world had been given form twice. It would not survive a third shaping, and so humanity learned, slowly and deliberately, how to live within the quiet space left behind. With time firmly anchored in measured cycles, humanity began to look backward, not only to remember catastrophe, but to reinterpret origin. The earliest age no longer functioned as a lost paradise or a mistake corrected by force. It became a reference point, a reminder that the universe itself had matured. Just as humans aged and learned restraint, so too had existence learned how to endure without tearing itself apart. The stories of creation were retold with quieter emphasis. The primordial waters were no longer feared as an imminent threat, but respected as an ever-present condition. Beneath the soil, beneath cities and graves, the deep still existed, held in place by balance rather than command. This understanding shaped how humans related to the land. Digging, building, and farming were acts performed with awareness, as if each strike into the earth acknowledged what lay below. Cosmic order was no longer imagined as fragile because of divine unpredictability. It was fragile because of human excess. The gods had stepped back, not because they were absent, but because intervention had proven too disruptive. Their silence implied trust. Humanity had been given enough knowledge to maintain balance on its own, provided it remembered. Memory became sacred in a new way. No longer carried primarily by priests or kings, it lived in routine. Festivals marked seasonal transitions. Legal traditions preserved lessons learned through failure. Even architecture reflected memory, with raised foundations and reinforced walls, silently recounting floods long past. The idea of divine favor evolved alongside this cultural shift. Blessing was no longer understood as miraculous abundance or conquest. It was continuity. A year without disaster was success. A generation without famine was triumph. The highest aspiration was stability rather than expansion. The gods themselves were increasingly understood as embodiments of principles rather than agents of action. Wisdom, justice, fertility, and restraint were personified not because they intervened directly, but because they needed to be remembered. Naming these forces gave them weight. Forgetting them invited imbalance. This abstraction did not weaken belief, it deepened it. Faith became less about expectation and more about alignment. Humans did not pray for gods to act, but for themselves to remain within order. Rituals emphasized humility and awareness rather than demand. The flood myth continued to anchor this worldview. It explained why growth must be limited, why noise must be restrained, why ambition must be tempered. The catastrophe was no longer feared as repeatable event, but respected as ultimate consequence. It was the boundary beyond which recovery was no longer guaranteed. Kingship absorbed this lesson fully. Rulers were judged by their ability to prevent extremes. Overexpansion, unchecked building, and constant warfare were signs of poor stewardship. The most praised reigns were those that left little to record because little went wrong. Law codes reinforced this ethic by focusing on restitution rather than revenge. Justice aimed to restore balance, not assert dominance. Punishment was measured, proportional, and corrective. Excessive force risked destabilizing the system it sought to protect. Human creativity adapted to these constraints. Art favored symmetry and repetition. Music followed established modes. Literature explored consequence rather than conquest. Stories focused on characters who learned restraint, not those who defied limits successfully. The afterlife retained its simplicity. No elaborate rewards awaited the virtuous. No eternal punishments awaited the wicked. Death remained final and equal. This certainty stripped life of illusion while giving it clarity. Meaning had to be created within a finite span. The gods of judgment remained unchanged, their role untouched by cultural evolution. They did not reward innovation or punish stagnation. They enforced closure. In doing so, they protected the living from the chaos of endless continuation. Endings mattered because they allowed beginnings to retain meaning. Humanity increasingly saw itself as caretaker rather than subject. The earth was not owned, it was maintained. Resources were finite. Water had to be guided carefully. Soil had to be preserved. Every action echoed beyond its immediate effect. The silence of the gods became a constant backdrop. When disasters occurred, they were interpreted not as messages, but as failures of alignment. The response was correction, not supplication. This marked a profound psychological shift. Responsibility had moved decisively into human hands. Yet humility remained essential. The memory of divine power was never erased. It lingered in myth, reminding humanity that the system they managed was inherited, not invented. Creation had not been their achievement. Survival was their task. The earliest age, once imagined as timeless and divine, now served as contrast. It represented possibility without restraint, power without limit. The post-flood world chose endurance over magnitude. This choice defined civilization's character. Time continued its steady flow, indifferent to aspiration. Generations rose and fell, cities flourished and declined, but the framework held. The world did not dissolve back into water. Balance endured. This endurance became the quiet miracle of the post-mythic age. No gods descended. No worlds were remade. Life persisted through discipline rather than spectacle. Humanity learned that survival did not require constant divine presence. It required memory, restraint, and the willingness to live within limits. In accepting this, humans completed the final separation begun at creation. Heaven remained distant. Earth remained heavy. The space between them belonged fully to mortal life. And within that space, shaped by silence and consequence, civilization learned how to continue. As centuries accumulated and memory settled into layered tradition, humanity grew accustomed to the weight of continuity. The world no longer felt newly formed or freshly rescued. It felt inherited. Each generation stepped into structures built by others, guided by laws shaped through trial and bound by customs that carried meanings few could trace to their origin. This inheritance was both gift and burden. It offered stability, but it also demanded obedience to patterns established long before living memory. The gods, now firmly positioned beyond daily reach, functioned as anchors rather than actors. Their names remained spoken, their symbols preserved, but their silence defined the era. This silence did not suggest indifference. It suggested completion. Creation, correction, and separation had already occurred. What remained was maintenance. The universe no longer needed shaping. It needed care. Human beings adjusted to this reality by redefining virtue. Strength was no longer measured by dominance or expansion, but by reliability. A good ruler was one whose reign passed without disruption. A good citizen was one who fulfilled duty without excess. Honor lay in consistency, not spectacle. This quiet ethic permeated social life, shaping expectations from leadership down to family structure. Memory of divine proximity survived in ritual language that few understood fully. Phrases repeated across generations retained power even as their original context faded. The words mattered less for what they explained than for what they reinforced. They reminded people that order existed before them and would continue after them, provided it was respected. Writing played a crucial role in preserving this mindset. Records became increasingly detailed, not out of obsession with control, but from fear of forgetting. Contracts, boundaries, and genealogies were inscribed to anchor identity in permanence. To lose a record was to risk disorder. Literacy carried responsibility. The written word stabilized reality by fixing intention. This fixation on continuity influenced how humanity approached uncertainty. Rather than seeking revelation, people sought precedent. The past became a guidebook. When faced with new challenges, leaders looked backward, not upward. Innovation was permitted only when it aligned with established pattern. Sudden change remained suspect, echoing the trauma of the flood. The natural world reinforced this caution. Seasons followed predictable cycles, but variation within those cycles kept people alert. A single failed harvest could ripple outward into famine and unrest. The lesson was clear. Stability was conditional. It had to be earned repeatedly. Religion adapted accordingly. Worship focused on appeasement rather than communion. The goal was not closeness, but balance. Offerings acknowledged dependence, not intimacy. Temples functioned as boundary markers, spaces where order was reinforced symbolically rather than challenged. The gods of judgment maintained their role as final arbiters, untouched by cultural evolution. Their authority remained absolute precisely because it was limited to endings. They did not interfere with growth or decline. They ensured closure. In doing so, they allowed life to move forward without fear of infinite consequence. This understanding shaped how humans viewed legacy. The desire to be remembered did not center on personal glory. It focused on contribution to continuity. Builders aimed to construct structures that would last. Lawgivers sought principles that could endure. Parents passed down knowledge rather than ambition. Death, ever present and unavoidable, sharpened this focus. Because life was finite and unequal in duration, meaning had to be found in alignment rather than extension. The briefness of existence made harmony more valuable than conquest. Excess risked shortening life further. The cosmos itself seemed to affirm this worldview. Catastrophes became less frequent, but more instructive. When disaster struck, it exposed weakness in systems rather than divine wrath. The response was repair, not ritual frenzy. Humanity increasingly trusted its capacity to restore balance. The mythic age receded further into abstraction. Long-lived kings and direct divine action became symbols rather than expectations. They represented formative conditions, not attainable goals. The distance between then and now was acknowledged without longing. Education reflected this maturity. Instruction emphasized history, law, and practical skill over heroic narrative. Children learned caution before courage. Survival depended on cooperation and foresight rather than boldness. The relationship between humanity and nature stabilized into cautious respect. Rivers were channeled but never assumed conquered. Land was cultivated but allowed to rest. Resource use was moderated by awareness of consequence. This restraint was not altruism, it was survival instinct refined into principle. In this environment, silence took on deeper meaning. Quiet signified balance. The absence of divine intervention indicated success. When nothing extraordinary occurred, it meant the system held. Stability became its own affirmation. The gods remained present through structure rather than presence. Their will was encoded in limits. Their influence manifested through consequence. Humanity learned to read these signals not as commands, but as conditions. By accepting this role, humans completed a transformation begun at creation. They moved from dependent participants in a divine project to custodians of an inherited world. Responsibility replaced obedience. Awareness replaced expectation. The memory of catastrophe remained essential. It guarded against complacency. The flood was not feared as returning event, but respected as ultimate example of what imbalance could provoke. It stood as a silent warning embedded in culture. Thus, the post-flood world continued, not with miracles or revelations, but with persistence. Civilization endured because it learned to value what could be maintained rather than what could be imagined. The gods watched, distant and silent, not because they had withdrawn care, but because care had finally been understood. As the long arc of civilization stretched forward, humanity grew increasingly aware that the world it inhabited was not neutral. Every structure, from law to landscape, carried intention. The quiet stability achieved after catastrophe did not exist by chance. It was maintained through vigilance, memory, and a shared understanding that disorder was never far away. This awareness sharpened perception. People learned to read the world as a system of signals rather than a stage for intervention. The distance between gods and humans, once feared, became functional. It allowed humanity to act without waiting for permission. Divine silence was interpreted as trust rather than abandonment. The absence of direct command forced humans to develop judgment. Choices could no longer be deferred upward. Responsibility settled firmly at ground level. This shift altered how humans understood error. Mistakes were no longer framed as offenses against gods, but as misalignments with reality. When crops failed, the response was not confession, but correction. When floods damaged settlements, engineering improved. Disaster became feedback rather than punishment. This practical worldview marked a decisive break from earlier dependence on divine will. The cosmos itself appeared to support this transition. Celestial movements followed consistent patterns. Stars returned to familiar positions. Eclipses could be predicted. Astronomy emerged not as prophecy, but as calculation. Knowing the sky became a way to anticipate the Earth. This predictability reinforced confidence that the universe operated according to discernible rules. Time, once mythic and fluid, was now segmented precisely. Calendars regulated ritual and labor alike. The future could be planned, not merely awaited. This planning did not imply control, but preparedness. The lesson of the flood was not that catastrophe was unavoidable, but that unpreparedness was fatal. Social organization reflected this pragmatism. Authority was distributed. Power was checked by custom and record. No single figure embodied divine mandate. Even kings operated within defined limits. Their legitimacy depended on maintenance of balance rather than personal charisma. The system valued continuity over innovation that risked destabilization. Religion continued to evolve within this context. It became increasingly symbolic, focusing on reenactment rather than revelation. Rituals reminded participants of cosmic structure, reinforcing humility and restraint. Worship acknowledged dependence on forces larger than humanity without expecting direct response. The underworld remained a constant presence in imagination, not as terror, but as certainty. Death defined the outer boundary of action. Knowing that all lives ended the same way encouraged fairness among the living. Excessive accumulation lost meaning in the face of inevitable conclusion. Mythological narratives adapted to reinforce these values. Stories emphasized consequence rather than triumph. Characters who ignored limits suffered. Those who accepted constraint endured. The moral landscape shifted away from heroism toward wisdom. Survival, not dominance, became the highest achievement. The memory of the earliest age persisted, but it was increasingly abstract. Long lifespans and divine proximity were understood as conditions that belonged to a formative phase of existence. They were necessary for creation, but incompatible with endurance. The world had grown beyond them. Humanity's relationship with nature matured accordingly. Exploitation gave way to management. Forests were harvested selectively. Fields were rotated. Water was guided rather than fought. These practices emerged not from idealism, but from hard-earned understanding. The environment responded predictably when respected. This respect extended inward. Human desire itself became subject to regulation. excessive ambition was discouraged. Moderation was praised. Social norms reinforced balance, recognizing that instability often began within individuals before spreading outward. Writing continued to anchor this worldview. Records preserved not only transactions but lessons. Failures were documented alongside successes. The past became a reservoir of instruction. Forgetting was treated as risk. Memory became a form of defense. The gods, increasingly distant, were no longer imagined as arbiters of daily fate. Their presence was felt in the structure of reality rather than in events. The universe did not react emotionally, it responded mechanically. Understanding this distinction allowed humans to adapt without resentment. The silence of the divine became the final confirmation of maturity. Intervention was no longer necessary because systems functioned. Humanity had learned to operate within limits. The cosmos no longer needed to correct itself through catastrophe. This did not eliminate suffering. Loss, failure, and death remained, but they were integrated into understanding rather than resisted. Pain became part of continuity, not evidence of abandonment. The flood remained the central reference point, but its meaning shifted. It was no longer a threat hanging over existence. It was a boundary marker, reminding humanity of what lay beyond balance. It defined the outer edge of possibility. In this stabilized world, meaning was found not in extraordinary events, but in sustained alignment. Life mattered because it was finite. Order mattered because it was fragile. Memory mattered because forgetting invited collapse. Humanity's greatest achievement was not creation or conquest, but endurance. Civilization persisted because it learned restraint. The gods had stepped back because their work was done. What remained was a world capable of sustaining itself, provided it was treated with care. This quiet persistence defined the age that followed. No miracles announced it. No divine voices marked its beginning. It unfolded gradually, shaped by understanding rather than command. And in that unfolding, humanity finally accepted its place not as favored child of the cosmos, but as its responsible inhabitant. As the generations lengthened into centuries, the quiet confidence of endurance began to reshape how humanity understood truth itself. Knowledge was no longer assumed to descend fully formed from beyond the world. It emerged through accumulation, correction, and careful transmission. What mattered was not revelation, but reliability. Ideas survived only if they proved useful across time, tested repeatedly against reality. This gradual shift transformed wisdom from something sacred and untouchable into something living and revisable. Old teachings were respected, but they were not immune to refinement. When a method failed, it was adjusted. When a law caused imbalance, it was amended. Authority did not dissolve. It adapted. The world demanded flexibility within constraint, and civilization responded by learning how to bend without breaking. The memory of divine creation still framed existence, but it no longer dictated interpretation. Humans understood that the gods had shaped the world's foundation, not its daily operation. What happened after creation unfolded within the structure left behind. This distinction allowed inquiry to flourish. Observation became a form of reverence. To study the stars, the soil, or the body was not to challenge the divine, but to honor the order that had been established. Natural phenomena were increasingly explained through pattern rather than intention. Floods followed rain and geography. Disease spread through contact and environment. Healing came from practice, not prayer alone. This did not eliminate spirituality. It redirected it. Wonder shifted from intervention to coherence. The universe inspired awe not because it was unpredictable, but because it was intelligible. This growing confidence in understanding did not lead to arrogance. On the contrary, it reinforced humility. The more humanity learned, the clearer its limitations became. Knowledge revealed complexity rather than mastery. Every solution introduced new variables. Every advancement carried consequences. Progress was possible, but never final. The concept of balance deepened as a result. Balance was no longer seen as static equilibrium, but as constant adjustment. Like steering a vessel through shifting currents, stability required continuous attention. Neglect, even brief, could undo years of effort. This understanding permeated governance, agriculture, and social life. Human relationships were shaped by the same principle. Communities thrived when roles were respected and boundaries maintained. Excessive control stifled cooperation. Excessive freedom invited disorder. Social harmony depended on negotiated limits, not rigid enforcement. Trust emerged as a form of shared restraint. The afterlife remained unchanged in its simplicity, reinforcing this ethic. Death did not reward cleverness or punish ignorance. It concluded equally. This impartial ending encouraged focus on life as lived rather than fate imagined. Meaning had to be created within time, not deferred beyond it. As memory of the flood receded further into the past, its influence persisted subtly. It informed architecture through elevation and drainage. It informed agriculture through rotation and storage. It informed politics through caution against unchecked expansion. The catastrophe was no longer vivid, but its lesson had been absorbed. Myth evolved to reflect this absorption. Stories became more nuanced, exploring moral complexity rather than clear divisions between right and wrong. Characters faced dilemmas without divine rescue. Outcomes depended on choice, timing, and awareness. The gods, when present, offered constraint rather than guidance. This narrative shift mirrored lived experience. Humanity had learned that no authority could eliminate uncertainty. Preparation mattered more than prayer. Foresight mattered more than force. The future could not be controlled, but it could be anticipated. Writing continued to play a central role in this evolution. Texts preserved not only rules, but reasoning. Commentaries emerged, explaining why laws existed rather than simply enforcing them. Education emphasized understanding over obedience. To know a rule was insufficient. One had to grasp its purpose. The relationship between humanity and the natural world grew increasingly reciprocal. Humans shaped the environment, but the environment shaped them in return. Droughts prompted innovation. Floods prompted restraint. Each response refined collective knowledge. Failure became instruction rather than condemnation. The gods, distant but not forgotten, occupied a symbolic space within this framework. They represented forces beyond human control, reminders that not everything could be predicted or prevented. Their stories maintained humility without paralyzing action. They framed uncertainty without dominating it. The underworld judges retained their role as final arbiters, unchanged by this intellectual evolution. Their constancy provided closure in a world of ongoing adjustment. No matter how understanding expanded, death remained the same. This fixed endpoint grounded all striving. Human ambition adapted accordingly. The desire to leave a mark shifted from conquest to contribution. Builders aimed to create structures that outlived them. Thinkers sought ideas that could endure revision. Parents focused on equipping the next generation rather than elevating their own name. Civilization became less dramatic, but more resilient. It no longer relied on singular heroes or divine moments. Its strength lay in networks, memory, and shared restraint. Collapse remained possible, but less likely. The system had learned from its own extremes. This maturity did not bring comfort in the modern sense. Life remained difficult, uncertain, and finite. But it brought clarity. Humanity understood the terms of its existence. The world was not hostile, but it was not forgiving. Survival depended on attention. In accepting this, humans completed a subtle transformation. They no longer lived in anticipation of divine correction or return. They lived within consequence, meaning emerged not from origin or destiny, but from participation in continuity. The gods had shaped the world and then stepped back. What followed was not abandonment, but inheritance. Humanity now lived in a universe that expected understanding rather than obedience. And within that expectation, civilization found its enduring form. As continuity became the defining measure of success, humanity began to recognize a subtle tension at the heart of its endurance. Stability, once achieved, carried the risk of stagnation. The same restraint that prevented collapse could, if left unexamined, harden into rigidity. Civilization learned that balance was not merely the absence of disruption, but the capacity to absorb change without breaking. This realization reshaped how tradition was treated. Customs were honored, but they were no longer beyond question. The past remained authoritative, yet not absolute. Each generation inherited patterns along with the responsibility to assess them. Preservation without understanding became a liability. Memory had to remain active to be useful. Institutions adapted to this insight by allowing limited flexibility. Law codes included provisions for amendment. Ritual calendars shifted subtly to reflect environmental change. Even architectural styles evolved, retaining foundational principles while responding to new needs. Innovation was no longer feared outright, it was regulated. The gods, still distant, provided a framework for this evolution. Their stories contained contradiction and adaptation, reflecting a universe that had never been static. Creation itself had involved rupture. Separation had been violent. Order had emerged through transformation. Remembering this allowed humanity to accept change as intrinsic rather than threatening. The flood myth, once a warning against excess, gained a secondary meaning. It demonstrated not only the danger of imbalance, but the possibility of renewal. Destruction had led to reorganization. Limits had been redefined. Survival had required adaptation. This dual lesson encouraged cautious openness to transformation. Human governance reflected this balance between continuity and change. Rulers were expected to maintain order, but also to respond to new circumstances. Blind adherence to precedent was increasingly criticized. Wisdom lay in discerning when to preserve and when to adjust. Authority became evaluative rather than declarative. Education evolved to support this discernment. Learning emphasized interpretation over memorization. Students studied not only what had been done, but why. This focus produced citizens capable of navigating uncertainty rather than merely obeying instruction. Understanding became the primary defense against disorder. The natural world continued to reinforce this lesson. Climate varied. Rivers shifted course. soil fertility changed over time. Survival required responsiveness. Practices that worked for one generation might fail in the next. Observation remained essential. This responsiveness extended to social relationships. Communities adapted roles as populations grew or declined. Family structures shifted. Trade networks expanded and contracted. Stability emerged not from fixed form, but from shared willingness to adjust within boundaries. The afterlife retained its simplicity, unchanged by these developments. Death remained final and equal, reinforcing urgency in life. Because endings were certain, adaptation mattered. One could not rely on infinite time to correct mistakes. Decisions carried weight. The gods of judgment continued their silent function. They did not reward innovation or punish conservatism. They enforced closure. Their neutrality reinforced the idea that meaning was created in life, not bestowed afterward. Human creativity flourished within this adaptive stability. Art explored variation within form. Music experimented within established modes. Literature examined the tension between tradition and change. These expressions mirrored societal balance, offering spaces to explore transformation safely. Mythological narratives were retold with emphasis on learning rather than defiance. Figures who adapted survived. Those who clung rigidly to old ways suffered. The gods, when present, served as catalysts rather than controllers. Their role was to initiate reflection, not dictate outcome. The distance between gods and humans remained essential. Direct intervention had proven disruptive. Silence allowed learning. The cosmos no longer corrected itself violently. It expected intelligent response. Humanity's maturity was measured by its ability to interpret signals rather than wait for command. The concept of sacredness shifted accordingly. Sacred was no longer what was untouched, but what was maintained. A canal carefully repaired was as sacred as a temple. A law thoughtfully revised carried as much weight as ancient decree. Reverence moved from object to process. Memory of the earliest age remained as context. Long-lived kings and divine proximity represented formative conditions, not ideals. They explained origin, but not purpose. Purpose emerged later, through endurance and adaptation. This understanding deepened humanity's sense of agency. The world was not finished. It was ongoing. Responsibility lay in sustaining function rather than recreating origin. The gods had provided structure. Humans provided care. As civilization expanded across regions, this ethic traveled with it. New lands required new adaptations, but the same principles applied. Balance, restraint, and responsiveness proved universal. Where they were ignored, collapse followed. Where they were honored, societies endured. The silence of the gods remained constant through these expansions. No new catastrophes reset the world. No revelations redefined order. Stability persisted because humanity had learned from its own history. This learning did not eliminate conflict or suffering. Disputes arose. Resources grew scarce. Errors occurred. But the framework held. Problems were addressed within structure rather than through destruction. In this way, humanity achieved a form of quiet sovereignty, not mastery over the world, but stewardship within it. The gods were neither rivals nor saviors. They were the architects of possibility. Humans were its caretakers. The universe, once loud with creation and correction, now unfolded through consequence and choice. The final lesson of endurance was clear. Survival depended not on returning to a mythic past, but on continuing forward with awareness. And so civilization persisted, shaped by memory, guided by restraint, and sustained by the understanding that balance was not something achieved once, but something lived every day. As the long experiment of endurance continued, humanity reached a stage where survival was no longer its sole measure of success. The world had not collapsed. Balance, though fragile, had held. This achievement invited a deeper reckoning with purpose. If existence could persist without divine intervention, without catastrophe, without mythic upheaval, then meaning had to be forged within that persistence itself. This realization reshaped how people understood legacy. No longer defined by singular events or divine favor, legacy became cumulative. What endured was not the brilliance of an individual moment, but the reliability of systems passed forward intact. A well-maintained canal mattered more than a heroic feat. A stable law mattered more than a victorious battle. Civilization measured itself by continuity. The gods, still silent, were not forgotten. Their withdrawal had become instructive. Absence was interpreted as completion. Creation had ended. Stewardship had begun. Humanity's task was not to seek new revelations, but to live competently within the structure already given. The divine role had shifted from actor to reference, from voice to boundary. This boundary sharpened ethical understanding. Without direct command, morality emerged from consequence. Actions were evaluated by their effect on balance rather than by obedience to decree. Right was what sustained order. Wrong was what threatened it. Ethics became practical rather than aspirational. Social cohesion depended on this practicality. Communities recognized that harmony could not be imposed from above. It had to be cultivated through shared restraint. Custom and law worked together, reinforcing behavior that preserved stability. Excessive individuality was discouraged not because it was immoral, but because it was destabilizing. The natural world remained an active participant in this moral framework. Drought, flood, and famine served as reminders of interdependence. These events were not moral judgments, but signals. They indicated misalignment between human activity and environmental capacity. The response was adjustment, not repentance. Knowledge became humanity's primary inheritance. Each generation received not only tools and land, but accumulated understanding. Teaching focused on judgment rather than rote instruction. To know how to respond mattered more than knowing what had been done before. Wisdom was adaptive. Art and literature reflected this maturity. Stories explored ambiguity rather than certainty. Characters faced choices without guaranteed outcomes. The gods appeared rarely, often as distant reminders rather than decisive agents. The drama lay in human decision, not divine intervention. The afterlife continued unchanged, reinforcing focus on the present. No future reward compensated for failure to live responsibly now. Death remained the final equalizer. This certainty encouraged humility and urgency. Time was precious because it ended. Political structures adapted to this ethic. Authority was increasingly accountable. Leaders were expected to justify decisions in terms of communal impact. Power without responsibility was recognized as a threat to balance. Governance became an exercise in restraint rather than control. Economic life followed similar principles. Accumulation was tolerated only within limits. Hoarding invited resentment and instability. Distribution ensured continuity. Trade connected regions, spreading not only goods but shared understanding of balance. The memory of catastrophe remained embedded but distant. The flood was no longer feared as imminent. It existed as conceptual boundary, a reminder of what happened when restraint failed entirely. Its lesson was preventative rather than corrective. As humanity spread across landscapes and generations, the same pattern repeated. Where memory was preserved, societies endured. Where memory faded, imbalance returned. Collapse followed not from fate, but from forgetting. The gods' silence remained consistent across these cycles. No warnings preceded failure. No rescues followed. The absence reinforced responsibility. The world responded to action, not intention. Understanding this distinction was central to survival. Spiritual life adapted accordingly. Reflection replaced petition. Ritual became reinforcement rather than appeal. Sacredness was found in maintenance, not miracle. A repaired structure held more meaning than a dramatic sacrifice. Human identity crystallized around stewardship. People saw themselves not as temporary occupants of the world, but as links in a chain. Each life mattered because it carried continuity forward. The present was meaningful because it shaped the future, not because it echoed the past. The mythic age remained distant, its figures larger than life, but no longer relevant as models. They explained origin, but not direction. Direction emerged from lived experience. The world had taught its lessons through consequence rather than command. In this final maturity, humanity accepted its position fully, not divine, not abandoned, but responsible. The universe did not promise safety. It offered structure. Within that structure, humans could flourish or fail. The enduring insight was simple and demanding. Balance was never permanent. It required attention, humility, and willingness to adjust. Silence from the gods was not neglect. It was trust. And so civilization continued, not waiting for the return of gods or the repetition of catastrophe, but grounded in the understanding that survival itself was the sacred task. In that understanding, humanity found meaning not beyond the world, but within it. At the far edge of this long memory, humanity stood fully within the world it had learned to sustain. Nothing dramatic marked this moment. No final revelation arrived. No voice descended from the sky to declare completion. What existed instead was a quiet continuity, the result of countless choices aligned more often than not with balance. The absence of catastrophe became the clearest sign that the system held. The universe no longer felt unfinished. Creation was not something awaited or repeated. It was something inherited. The structures that once required divine force to establish now persisted through habit, law, and collective understanding. Humanity did not replace the gods. It fulfilled the role that distance had made possible. Stewardship was no longer an aspiration. It was identity. Time, once vast and elastic, had settled into human scale. Lives passed quickly enough to make memory valuable and slowly enough to make learning possible. Each generation inherited both stability and risk. Nothing guaranteed survival except attention. This awareness shaped how people approached the future. Planning mattered. Excess did not. The primordial waters still existed beneath everything, not as threat, but as reminder. They symbolized potential without form, the state to which everything could return if balance failed. The world rested above them, not through force, but through maintenance. This image endured because it expressed a truth that never expired. Order was not permanent, it was sustained. The gods remained present in this understanding, though not as actors. They were the memory of how structure came into being. They represented the forces that shaped the world before humans were capable of care. Their stories were not instructions, but context. They explained why limits existed and why crossing them carried consequence. The earliest age, with its long-lived rulers and divine proximity, was fully absorbed into this context. It no longer tempted imagination. It clarified origin. Humanity did not seek to return to it because it understood why it had ended. That world was powerful, but unstable. This one was limited, but enduring. The flood, once central and terrifying, now functioned as a boundary marker in thought. It defined the edge of tolerable imbalance. Everything before it belonged to formation. Everything after belonged to responsibility. The catastrophe was not a threat waiting to return. It was the lesson that made return unnecessary. Human systems reflected this maturity. Governance emphasized correction over punishment. Law evolved through experience. Knowledge circulated widely enough to prevent dependence on singular authority. Collapse, when it occurred, was local rather than total. Recovery followed because memory survived. Conflict did not disappear. Scarcity still existed. Failure still occurred. But these were no longer existential threats. They were challenges within a framework resilient enough to absorb them. The world bent rather than broke. The underworld judges remained unchanged through all of this. Their constancy defined the outer boundary of life. Death remained final, equal, and inescapable. This certainty did not diminish life. It sharpened it. Meaning existed because time ended. Urgency existed because continuity depended on finite effort. Human creativity found its final form in refinement. The greatest achievements were those that required no constant defense. Systems that functioned quietly were prized above spectacles that demanded attention. The ideal was not dominance, but durability. Spiritual life reflected this clarity. Silence was no longer unsettling. It was expected. The absence of divine intervention meant alignment held. When disruption occurred, it was treated as signal rather than message. Response replaced supplication. The cosmos no longer needed to teach through destruction. Humanity had learned through memory. The separation of sky and earth remained intact. The waters were contained. The air carried breath rather than storm. This stability was not accidental. It was earned repeatedly. The final understanding that emerged from this long arc was neither mystical nor cynical. It was practical. The universe was not hostile, but it was indifferent. It offered structure, not protection. Within that structure, life could flourish or fail based on attention and restraint. Humanity accepted this without resentment. There was no loss in the gods' silence. There was clarity. Responsibility no longer needed justification. It was simply required. The story that began with undifferentiated water ended with deliberate care. The movement from potential to form, from force to balance, from proximity to distance, traced a single trajectory. Creation had given way to maintenance. Myth had given way to memory. Power had given way to responsibility. Nothing further needed to happen for the story to be complete. The absence of ending was itself the conclusion. Civilization continued not because it was protected, but because it was aware. And so the world endured, held in place not by divine command or cosmic violence, but by the accumulated understanding that balance was not something achieved once, but something lived, moment by moment, generation by generation, above the quiet waters that still waited beneath everything.